In 1867, when Canada became a country, its economy was built on fur, timber, and fish. Tangible things. Real output. Today, it's built on something far more unusual. Canadians selling houses to one another and calling it economic growth. Let me be very clear about what that means. One of the richest nations on earth has quietly reshaped its economy so that a massive share of its prosperity comes from people buying and selling the same homes back and forth at ever higher prices. And somehow, this was rebranded as progress. Economic miracles are supposed to look like this. Making things, building things, inventing things that didn't exist before. Canada used to do that. It had factories that produced goods people wanted. It had resource industries that pulled wealth out of the ground. It had technology sectors that created real innovation. Now it has real estate agents. The numbers tell a deeply uncomfortable story. Real estate and housing-related activity now account for roughly 13% of Canada's GDP. Manufacturing, the sector that actually creates physical products, accounts for closer to 10%. Canada now generates more economic activity from housing transactions than from building cars, airplanes, machinery, and consumer goods combined. Think about that for a moment. A country is measuring success by how expensive it can make shelter, a basic human necessity, and then congratulating itself for the achievement. This didn't happen overnight. To understand how Canada got here, you have to go back to the 1990s. The economy was struggling. Interest rates were high. Inflation had been a problem. Manufacturing was losing ground to overseas competition. Canada needed a new growth engine, and it found one in an unexpected place. Mortgages. Governments and banks realized something brilliant in a twisted way. If you make it easier for people to borrow huge amounts of money to buy houses, several things happen at once. Construction jobs appear. Real estate agents get hired. Lawyers process transactions. Inspectors inspect. Mortgage brokers broker. Banks earn interest for decades. And here's the clever part. When house prices rise, everyone who already owns a home feels wealthier. They feel optimistic. They spend more. They borrow against home equity. They vote for whoever's in charge. It looks like a self-sustaining system, a perpetual motion machine of prosperity. Except perpetual motion machines don't exist. They violate the laws of physics. And this system violates the laws of sustainable economics. By the early 2000s, the machine was humming. Prices in Toronto and Vancouver rose steadily. Not explosively yet, but enough to reward homeowners and worry renters. Construction boomed. Suburbs spread outward like coffee spilled across a table. Then came 2008. The U.S. housing market collapsed. Banks failed. The global financial system nearly imploded. Countries around the world watched housing bubbles burst and drag entire economies down with them. Canada looked at that disaster and learned exactly the wrong lesson. While the United States dealt with foreclosures and bank failures, Canada's housing market barely flinched. Prices dipped slightly, then recovered. Politicians declared victory. The Canadian banking system is the soundest in the world. The phrase was repeated so often it became a national mantra. What actually happened was simpler and far more dangerous. Canada responded to the crisis by making it even easier to borrow money for housing. Interest rates fell to historic lows. Mortgage rules loosened. The federal government backed more and more loans, putting taxpayers on the hook if things went wrong. Housing didn't just recover, it exploded. Between 2000 and 2020, average home prices in Canada more than tripled. In Toronto and Vancouver, they quadrupled. A modest Toronto home that sold for $300,000 in 2000 was worth over $1 million. In Vancouver, tear-down houses sold for $2 million. And everyone celebrated. GDP was growing. Employment looked strong. Homeowners watched their net worth rise without producing anything new. They simply owned a building that became more valuable because others borrowed more to buy similar buildings. Here's the question no one wanted to ask. Who was actually creating value? When a factory builds a car, value is created. When a farmer grows wheat, value is created. When a developer writes software, value is created. But when a house sells for $100,000 more than it did 5 years ago, what changed? The house is the same. Same walls, same roof, maybe fresh paint. The transaction generated commissions, legal fees, and interest payments. Created paperwork, not wealth. One person gained money, another gained debt. GDP went up. That's when things started to break. By the mid-2010s, the consequences became impossible to ignore. Young Canadians were being priced out entirely. A generation raised to expect starter homes in their 20s or 30s found that starter homes now cost $750,000. Even households earning well above the median couldn't afford average homes in Toronto or Vancouver. The only buyers left were people trading up, people with parental help, or people taking on debt so large that one shock meant disaster. And yet, GDP kept rising. Because an economy built on housing inflation requires housing inflation to continue. The moment prices stop rising, everything cracks. Construction slows. Transactions dry up. Equity borrowing stops. Spending falls. Jobs disappear. Canada wasn't growing. It was trapped. While housing boomed, productivity stagnated. Workers weren't producing more per hour. Wages didn't rise meaningfully. Competitiveness declined. In a normal economy, then came COVID. In the middle of a global shutdown, Canadian house prices surged. Near-zero interest rates and massive stimulus poured fuel on the fire. Mortgage payments on million-dollar homes suddenly looked manageable. Prices soared again. Canada officially grew during a pandemic because people sold houses to one another at higher prices. If that sounds insane, that's because it is. Inflation returned. Rates rose. Borrowers who bought at peak prices faced renewals they couldn't afford. Payments jumped. Defaults increased. Cracks spread. Canada now faces a fundamental problem. The economy depends on housing inflation, but housing is no longer affordable. Buyers are disappearing. Debt limits are being reached. This is a structural trap. If prices fall, GDP falls. If prices stagnate, growth slows. If prices rise, an entire generation is locked out permanently. There is no painless outcome. Canada chose short-term GDP over long-term productivity. It mistook asset inflation for prosperity. It rewarded ownership over creation. And now the bill is due. An economy built on selling houses to itself isn't an economy. It's a shell game. And the music is starting to stop. Canada has everything it needs to build real wealth: skilled workers, resources, institutions, global access. What it lacked was the will to prioritize production over speculation. That was the choice. This is the consequence. An economy that looks healthy on paper but feels broken to live in. Canada didn't lose its economy overnight. It traded it away one mortgage at a time. And now it has to decide whether it wants to keep inflating houses or start building something real again before the illusion finally collapses.